Hi, everyone. Welcome. We still have a few people logging in, so we're going to give them just a minute or two to get settled, and then we'll get underway. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining the Link Center for this shared learning group. Today, we are focused on the topic of navigating risky behaviors. I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items while we get started. The session is being recorded, and the recording and the transcripts, along with the slide deck, will be made available on our website. And we welcome you to visit that, revisit it, to see the content yourself and share it with others. Attendees cannot see the names of other attendees, and all attendees are muted. Please use the chat function in Zoom to communicate with other attendees and the host during the webinar. You can use the chat by clicking on chat at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that your name will appear in the chat if you make a comment, and if you wish, you can change your display name by clicking on those three dots next to your name and selecting Rename. We will have representatives from the Link Center watching the chat and responding throughout the session today. And if you'd like, you can submit a question or a comment privately to the host and the panelists. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We do have live captioning and sign language interpreters present today. We will be spotlighting the active speaker and the ASL interpreter throughout the webinar. If you click on View on your Zoom screen, you can change the way you see the panelists. And if you have any trouble with your view, you can let us know that in the chat. At this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Stacy Nonamaker, who's going to get started with today's presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I am very excited to be here with you all today to talk about the topic of navigating risky behaviors. As Stephanie said, I am Stacy Nonamaker. I'm with NASDs, who's one of the partners of the Link Center, a grant funded through the Administration for Community Living. I am, just to give you a visual description, I am a middle-aged white woman with straight brown shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm also wearing a maroon and white flowered blouse today with a white background. So some of you may still not know what the Link Center is, and we urge you to jump up on our website to find out more about what it is we're doing, the things that we have in terms of resources and information up on the website, really all with the goal in mind to provide tools and resources to better support individuals with co-occurring conditions. We are just in the beginning of curating resources and information and getting this up on the website for you all. So check us out now and check back often to see what we're up to. So about our time together today, this is a shared learning group. It's a quarterly gathering that we've been doing for over a year now. This is our 5th shared learning group. And every quarter we host a series of meetings, 4 to be exact. Earlier today, we hosted a meeting with direct support professionals. This one is for clinical professionals. Tomorrow, we'll be gathering with individuals with lived experiences and then families of people with lived experience. And certainly while we're identifying roles and we do use the same content and tailor it for each group, we encourage people not to box themselves into one role or one title, audience or title, if you will. So please just, join us for any and all of the gatherings. We're happy to have you. The content that we put together for the shared learning groups is really a collaboration and a partnership among the Link Center partners. And those partners include people with lived experience, researchers, and people who work on policy issues. As Stephanie said, we are recording and transcribing the meeting today, and we'll post all of that on the Link Center website to give you even more incentive to check us out. So what are we going to be accomplishing today? Well, first of all, we want to hear from you all. We want to hear who's joining us. That's always so helpful. If you could put your name, any group, association, or membership that you may have in the chat, say hello. It's also great to hear where you're joining us from. Today, I'm joining from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So it's just fun to see who's joining from across the nation, and just really great to have all of you here with us today. So we'll be talking about navigating risky behaviors, and I'll be turning it over in just a few moments to my colleagues and partners of the Link Center, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN. And we're going to be, which is the shared learning group, right? We're going to be sharing what we as the Link Center have been thinking about this topic. We're going to be sharing resources and information that we've been gathering on this topic, not exhaustive. So again, we encourage you to jump on the website to check out some of the other resources we've been curating. And then we're going to ask you, what resources, training, and information that you go to when you're thinking about supporting someone with risky behaviors. We're going to present in a group exercise a scenario where we're going to give you some different ways, hopefully, to be thinking about supporting someone who's engaging in, quote, risky behaviors. And that's really going to be focusing on hearing from you. Again, with an eye on, we want to share what we've been thinking about, but we know that's not the end all be all, and we want to hear from you all what you think about when you think about navigating risky behaviors, when you think about this topic, where you go. So the next few slides are really just some ground setting in our time together today, and they were developed by people with lived experience who are on our steering committee for the Link Center. I'll talk a little bit more about our steering committee in just a moment. But we find these slides to be really helpful so that we're all on the same page in our time together, creating really just a safe, open space for us to be sharing, for us to be, offering our perspectives and our experience. So this meeting, we'll be talking about people's experience in being supported. Some people have experienced trauma, and that makes it hard to recover and move forward. So we encourage you all to take care of yourself, do what's necessary for your own comfort and care. And just a reminder that we should be gentle with ourselves and with each other, because sometimes this is hard work to do. And we also want to celebrate that we are all individuals from different backgrounds. We celebrate that we have shared experiences to learn from, and we know that we are each unique with our own experiences in the world. And finally, I think most importantly is that we're here to listen to one another and to share, and doing that with open minds and kindness, and that we do not judge or blame others for what they share. So again, hoping that these sort of set the stage for us to have some safe space for us to learn from one another, to hear from one another. So thank you so much. I'm so excited to see so many people saying hello in the chat, some familiar names that I'm seeing. So welcome to everyone. And while we're at it, while we're using the chat, and just really to kick off the topic, I'm going to pose a question to you all and really want to hear what you're thinking. So getting your baseline of the topic. When we use the words risky behavior, you hear those words. What comes to mind for you? And no pressure. We've already, like I said, had our session with direct support professionals. They were really engaging, offered some really great things that we all can be thinking about here at the Link Center. So I'll just be quiet for a second and see what starts coming through. Great. So I'm seeing drug and alcohol use, making bad choices, risk of harm of some kind to yourself or others, substance abuse again, behaviors that can be harmful to self or others, threat to self or others, unsafe and uneducated sexual choices, engaging in activity that is risk of harm to self or others, substance abuse, safety awareness, a spectrum of things. It may be behavior that in itself is risky, even if the person is not intentionally risk-taking. It could be decision that contains risk. Internet interactions with scammers, self-injurious behavior, physical aggression, taking off on your own without telling anyone where you are going, elopement, property destruction, all really, really great things. And thank you so much. Hopefully I got as many as I could. That's always the trick and the challenge with chat, is keeping up with the comments that are coming in. But I think we're getting a sense, and it's super helpful for my colleagues who will be going through the content today to really get an understanding of where you all are and how you're defining that, sort of abstract words of risky behaviors. So thanks so much. And we'll be asking you again later on in our time together to really be doing some good thinking around this topic as well. So we'll be back to ask you to engage in that chat. So as I mentioned, we have a steering committee with the Link Center, and that is comprised of 14 individuals with very varied lived experience across the nation. And these folks really guide or drive the work of the Link Center, and we're just really beyond thrilled to have their expertise, both personal and professional, and their experience that they are giving to us to help us do this work. Back in September, we met in person, and navigating risky behaviors was one topic we were able to really talk about. So what you're seeing in front of you is the graphic representation of that robust conversation. And today you're going to hear some of these words really sprinkled throughout the content that really is going to bring life and lived experience to what Jules and Noor will be talking about today. So we just wanted to take a moment to absolutely give thanks to the steering committee members and to acknowledge their commitment to informing this work. We know that it is, as one steering committee member called it, it's emotional labor as well as time and energy, and we're so very grateful to have their words and their experience that they're sharing with us. So we are, as I said, we are going to be bringing some of these words into the content today, and we had gotten the permission from each and every one of the steering committee members to do that and to share that all with you. So now, without further ado, I have the honor and pleasure to introduce my colleagues from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Jules Good and Noor Pervez. I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Jules Good. I use they, them pronouns. I am the programs coordinator at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I am a white person with short pink hair, wearing big old glasses and a t-shirt with the ASAN logo on it. And I just wanted to share, just to kind of position myself in this topic. I am a person who is dual diagnosed with developmental disabilities and mental health disabilities. And I'm also someone who has struggled with quote unquote risky behaviors in the past. And so that is one of the lenses that I bring to our discussion here today. And now I will turn it over to Noor.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, I'm Noor. I use he, they pronouns. I'm the community engagement manager with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. As a visual description, I am a South Asian person with black curly hair put up in a bun, and I'm wearing a gray t-shirt and I have glasses. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So helpfully and unhelpfully, yeah, as a starting point here, when we're talking about the concept of risky behaviors, if you've looked at studies around this, if you've looked at like professional content in this general realm, something you'll probably have noticed, and that we also noticed, not everyone means the same thing when they talk about quote unquote behaviors that need support or intervention. And this is actually really important because that impacts both what is considered something that merits intervention and what individual people consider as something that needs some sort of interference can vary really, really widely. So we're going to touch on some ways that that can kind of shift and impact the ways that we approach treatment and around like any given thing. So speaking very literally, behaviors are anything that we do, but behaviors, quote unquote, here usually means something that's considered weird or disruptive that a disabled person does. And weird and disruptive, you'll notice, are both really relative and unhelpfully vague terms. And we're going to get into both why that is and the ways that that impacts how we kind of navigate talking about this. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by risky behaviors? For the purposes of this presentation, we're talking about behaviors that can basically consist of harming yourself or other people. You'll hear us talk about the term substance misuse a whole bunch. That's chosen pretty intentionally here because using a substance at all. So for example, if you are over the age of 21 in the US and you're going to a bar and you're having a drink, whether you're disabled or not, that is considered a fairly standard activity among adults, yeah? However, if someone is using a given substance repeatedly in a way that causes risk of justice system involvement. So, for example, risks dealing with police or risks dealing with other various forms of law enforcement, say the fire department, that's something we could categorize more as substance misuse because it is being done in a way that can harm ourselves or other people. We also are going to talk about self-soothing in a way that causes harm. So for example, hair pulling, biting yourself until you bleed, other forms of self-contact that can cause harm. And we're also talking about attempts at self-regulating that can result in harm to others around you. So for example, yelling or speaking angrily to try and feel less afraid, but in the process, maybe making verbal threats to people or otherwise saying things that are going to cause harm. And it's worth pointing out here that context is super relevant because if, for example, you're at a ball game or like on the side of a baseball court and people are yelling in support of their team, that in and of itself isn't risky, right? Because the context dictates that that's something that's the norm for the area. And that's part of kind of something we're going to point out throughout the presentation here, which is that the context in which something happens can help determine if it's something that is at risk of causing harm versus if it's something that has a cultural context that is happening around this. Next slide, please. So again, while kind of navigating this, it's important to note that doing risky behaviors doesn't inherently make someone a bad person. Most of the time, someone doing a risky behavior does not mean to cause harm. And while we're thinking about that, it's important to note that because we're talking about disabled folks, a lot of the stuff that we do is often pathologized or kind of put through the lens of it being unique or different because it's someone disabled doing it. So when talking about risk, a concept that we try to encourage people to think about is dignity of risk, which is this idea that we need to be able to take risks in order to learn and grow. We'll elaborate on this some more later, but as kind of an introductory, like kind of putting the kernel of thought, think about this in terms of someone who might be learning to walk for the first time, assuming that that's something that person's body is able to do. In order for someone to learn how to take their first steps, think about a kid, right? You have to let them fall a few times, and you have to let them get experience in their body, learning how to balance, learning how to pull themselves up on furniture, learning how to balance against furniture. And in order to take any of those foundation steps towards walking and moving forward, they have to first figure out how to balance themselves, how to balance against things, how to feel the beginnings of that motion. And along the way, they're going to fall down a couple of times because they haven't done it yet. They don't know what they're doing yet, right? So when we're thinking about dignity of risk, we're thinking about this idea that in order to learn new things, you have to be allowed to make mistakes. You have to be allowed to do the thing messily and badly in some cases. And in some cases, like doing a mistake, making a mistake over and over to learn new things each time in order to eventually move towards doing the thing in a way that works more for them. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about that, it's important to recognize that risky behaviors don't come just kind of out of the ether. They don't come from nowhere. Risky behaviors are usually showing us an unmet need. So going back to the August shared learning group, we talked about social determinants of health. So this idea that our environment and our background can shape what we do. So when looking at risk factors for risky behaviors, we're looking at things in a similar way, where we're thinking about how our environment, our background, the stuff that we have learned from the world around us and the people around us has kind of had an impact on what we've learned and how we act. Next slide, please. So when thinking about risk factors, you knew it was coming. Trauma is a really key thing that we need to look at when we're looking at risk factors for a risky behavior. So when I say trauma, often the first thing that comes to people's minds is very individual trauma. So for example, someone who may have come from an abusive household, someone who might have been subject to being physically harmed in some way from other people or emotionally harmed in some way very directly from other people. And that absolutely is one possible risk factor. It's important to recognize that in that context, there's also both individual and structural traumas, and that those things can kind of interplay with each other. So for example, when I say structural trauma, a lot of the things that come to mind in terms of, for example, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, all of those things can kind of read in people's minds as being very direct, literal translations. So, for example, hate crime on behalf of any of those groups that are being targeted, right? And again, absolutely is a form of trauma, does happen. However, there's also broader things to think about that fit those criteria. So, for example, when I say racism, there are direct translations of that. There's directly being harmed, made fun of, had things thrown at you as a result of your racial background. There's also things that are more subtle, but that are built into the way our society is. So, for example, statistically, people of color and people who are lower income, especially people who are both, are a lot likelier to be living in an environment subject to higher rates of environmental pollution. That's a result of a number of factors. In some cases, historical redlining has kind of shifted the way that certain neighborhoods have developed over time, for example. And in some cases, that's if you're living in a bigger city with better access to certain programs, what have you, you're going to be closer to pollution. There's a lot of different factors that lead us there, right? But we know that that's a thing that happens. And when people are directly next to a lot of pollution, that can cause structural, ongoing, increased likelihood of health problems. So for example, younger rates of developing asthma, younger rates of developing chronic illnesses. And among people who already have some of those things, for example, some elderly folks, we know that it's a lot likelier that those things are going to be made worse over time. And the more sick someone becomes, the more health issues someone develops, the likelier they are to be subject to some of the inherent trauma of being disabled in a world that's not super designed for disabled people. So having to navigate getting around, using transport systems that might not be super designed with your body in mind, dealing with the social issues that come with being more sickly and having a body that might not get to places on time or be as reliable as it has historically. And then also you add in like the structural discrimination factors of suddenly having to put in more work to go places, having trouble if a place's elevator breaks down and you use a mobility aid. You have repeated likelihood to have to see a doctor more often, and like tends to be the case with access to any system repeatedly, that's going to increase your rate of having a negative experience, right? Because you're there by the numbers more often, there's a higher likelihood you're going to run into someone who does not treat you well, unfortunately. So you put in all of those factors, and it wraps all the way back to a racist root, right? This idea that people are being pushed towards these places that are less healthy for them. But also, following that route all the way down, you get those individual traumas as a result of the structural problem. So when we're looking at risk factors for risky behaviors, thinking about possibly, for example, PTSD as a result of repeated medical abuse, for example, or PTSD as a result of the ways that you might be structurally mistreated and the ways that that can impact whether or not you're willing to leave the house, for example, because maybe you've developed agoraphobia or a strong fear of being outside in inaccessible places because that's caused you harm before, right? So these things are separate, but they're also not. They weave together in ways that people might not initially think. So when we're looking at kind of the byproducts of that, it's important to think about trauma-informed care. And some of the layers of that are covered here are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural and historical and gender issues. So we're going to touch on elements of all of these throughout the presentation, but just as kind of an overview, these are all kind of ideas that we want folks to think about and integrate as we're talking about how to kind of approach understanding risky behaviors and also understanding how we're going to navigate kind of dealing with in the moment the impacts of those behaviors. Next slide, please. Another factor that can often be engaged with risky behaviors is a lack of communication supports. One film example that I often point people towards is the film This Is Not About Me, which is a documentary from the AAC group Assistiveware about Jordan Zimmerman, who is a non-speaking autistic person who did not have access to communication supports for most of her time in the K-12 public school system, and the ways that that lack of communication access impacted the ways that other people treated her. So throughout the documentary, Jordan reflecting back on her experiences, and the film also talks to various educators and people who were in her life at these various times, kind of talks about the fact that people assumed that Jordan could not learn things, could not understand things, and that the ways that they behaved that were perceived as risky, so running away from school, shouting, self-injurious behavior, things in that realm, were often written off as ways to seek attention purely for the sake of getting a reaction, rather than ways of acting that were meant to try and communicate the fact that she wasn't being listened to, that she wasn't being provided the supports that she needed in order to interact with her environment, to communicate the fact that she could learn, and that she was frustrated emotionally with this deeply restrictive setting that was kind of given to her as a result of this assumption that she was incompetent. So as a result, like a lot of her life goals as a young person, for example, her goal of becoming a teacher from a fairly young age, were just buried beneath this assumption that she was effectively not a person, not someone worth dealing with. So when we talk about risk factors for risky behaviors, taking away AAC, so alternative and augmentative communication, forcing speech, not offering accessible communication and forms of it. So when thinking about, for example, deaf and hard of hearing folks being denied language access, being denied access to sign language, if that's something that folks want in order to learn and engage with things, and also for folks who are speakers of other languages natively, denying them access to resources in a language they understand, as well as for folks who want to learn English but who may not have resources accessible to them in a method, a way that they can gain access. That's also something to think about because it can really challenge the ways that people see them, but also it can challenge their ability to communicate their needs and their access to resources, which can be understandably extremely frustrating. A steering committee member also mentions that sensory needs need to be taken seriously and seen as an integral part of mental health care. Our culture does not make time for breaks and meeting bodily needs. So, again, when talking about kind of going full circle with this, communication access is a need to be able to integrate all of those pieces. And in order to meet sensory needs, you need to be able to kind of find ways to navigate that with the person in question. Jules.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to toss in here, while we're talking about communication that I forgot to put on the slide is, a lot of what we're talking about here is access to expressive communication. So like being able to say what you think, but we also need to consider, especially in clinical settings, access to receptive communication. So understanding what other people are saying. One of our steering committee members, Emily Brown, is blind, and one of the things that she brought up a lot in our in-person meeting is how frustrating it is when she's seeking out care and there's no way for her to read the forms and the information that are there, and so she has to have someone else read it to her, which takes away her privacy and autonomy. So that's just another thing to consider when we're talking about communication too, is access to all of the information that you need to take in.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. And additional things to think about when kind of navigating quote unquote risky behaviors, a lot of things are more shared ground than people tend to realize. So, for example, if you're at a bar and you're having a drink with some friends, think about why you might be doing that. It might be to try and kind of calm your nerves, to try and make it easier for you to talk to your friends, make it easier to converse, what have you. Kind of trying to use that as a way to lower your inhibitions to meet a need for connection. Likewise, someone who's disabled who might be having a drink, including when they might be having a few that put them in a more risky territory, the route for that can be the same. It can be the same reason a lot of people drink during social events: coping with overstimulation, having social anxiety, wanting to fit in with people around us. These can all be rooted in this same kind of need for connection. So when looking at what's happening to what someone's doing in a given context, it's important to work backwards and think about the root feeling or emotional thing or the root need that is possibly trying to be met through a given action. And while we're thinking about that, it's important to note that disabled people are often held to a higher standard because everything we do is medicalized. So what do I mean by that? An example I'll often give folks is one that a friend of mine who is a professor in Chicago who teaches disability studies and is disabled often gives is in one of her first classes, she does an exercise where she'll turn to her class and she'll go, okay, so as a place to start, let me tell you about one of my friends. So this person is 22. They are a young adult male. They are living at home with their family. Their room isn't the tidiest. They tend to eat a lot of junk food. They play League of Legends and online games a whole bunch. They don't have a job. They're not really looking to get a job. what advice would you give my friend? Like, what would you tell them? And people in this class suggested everything from vocational rehab and vocational supports to getting a counselor involved and screening for mental health disabilities, all the way up to and including institutionalization or being put into a day program, with the idea being that someone else would take care of making sure that they had a structure and a routine. And after hearing all of these suggestions, the professor would just kind of look at them and would go, okay, so I'm hearing all of these things that people are suggesting. I just want to point out something. How does this change if I tell you that that person is not disabled? And everyone's faces just kind of drop. Because what they realize is that if you're looking at someone who you haven't mentally cataloged as disabled, who's, let's say, a 22-year-old young guy who's kind of a slob, living with their parents, might be college age, but not in college yet, you might have your own moral feelings about what their life position is, right? But you wouldn't immediately default to, oh, well, this person needs clinical services. This person needs X, Y, and Z things to get them to a different place in their life. But because they've mentally cataloged this young man as disabled, oh, suddenly all of these services are necessary because clearly they're out of control of their life. This is what I mean when we talk about the idea that disabled people are held to a higher standard. So when thinking about a quote unquote risky behavior, it's really critical that we, before we go towards the route of like involvement, first evaluating like, is this something I'd think would be risky if this person wasn't disabled? Or is it just something where I might have a different moral idea about what's happening, but this person's an adult, this is a normal adult behavior. Maybe they need some additional context about risks that they might not have foreseen, but it's their choice to make, right? So getting back to the heart of like choice, autonomy, power, and control. So thinking about kind of these roots of where an action is coming from and making sure that people have as much autonomy as possible when navigating these choices. A quote that I ended up going back to a bunch when we were kind of brainstorming for this session is that the pain you know is better than the pain you don't. So when someone is doing something risky, it very well could be that they're taking a risk that feels safer than the alternative. So, for example, drinking in excess at an event might be something that they're used to doing because it feels safer than the risk of being in an overstimulating environment, than the risk of their friends looking down on them for not drinking or for seeming stuck up, for example. The pain you know, the pain you're familiar with, that your body is adjusted to, tends to be easier for people to accept than a new or different risk. Next slide, please. So while looking at this, we also try to think about the fact that folks tend to kind of be in resource silos, which is to say that there are very few supports that really accommodate dual diagnosed people. So, for example, we have a news story that happened recently of a man in Oregon who was denied mental health support because clinicians thought his symptoms were behaviors. So, for example, if someone is dealing with suicidal thoughts or ideation or self-injurious behaviors, sometimes there can be the assumption of, oh, they're just doing it for attention, or oh, they're just trying to get a reaction, can really put people in danger if it leaves out the ability to see or examine if folks have additional conditions, additional supports that they might need or benefit from. And also, one thing that I always try to touch on when I use that phrase to try and point at what the assumption is, needing attention is still pointing at an underlying need. It's still pointing at, hey, there's something that's not being met that I am asking for support with. They might be doing it in a way that people find annoying or upsetting, or frankly, that can be harmful in some cases. And all of that can be true, and it can still be a need that they're trying to get met, right? So things to think through as we're looking at this. This also points at the idea of diagnostic overshadowing. So saying that everything someone experiences is because of one diagnosis instead of recognizing that we experience multiple problems at once. So again, and if you are looking at any given person who's experiencing suicidality who might also be autistic, it just kind of going, oh, well, of course they're having a hard time. They're autistic. Having autism is hard. Like that's, again, kind of overshadowing, leaving out the possibility that they might have additional stuff going on. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to transition it back to Jules to talk about how we support people who are doing quote unquote risky behaviors.
Thank you, Noor. So one of the first steps that we have to undertake if we're going to be supporting people who are engaging in risky behaviors is changing how we look at what support means. So right now, a lot of support or quote unquote treatment or intervention, whatever you want to call it, uses a very punitive lens when dealing with risky behaviors, which is to say, if you keep doing this behavior, you will be punished. You will face some sort of consequence. And we're going to talk about why that is an issue for a lot of people and why it's not effective here in a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about the lens that we want to move towards, which is a restorative lens. And when we were looking at this through a restorative lens, what we're really saying is, let's figure out why you're doing this, why you're engaging in this behavior, so that we can stop or reduce the amount of harm that's happening to either you or to the people around you as a result. And part of looking at things through a restorative lens is understanding that holding people accountable does not mean that we punish them and give up on them. It means that we help people to understand the natural consequences, so the things that happen as a direct result of their behavior, and to support them in repairing any harm that may have been caused as a result of the behavior. So part of understanding how to move towards that restorative lens is identifying what the unmet need is that is leading to this behavior in the first place. And we have a few quotes from some of our steering committee members who had so many brilliant insights on this topic. So Perry said, observe the context behind the behavior. Don't just assume the person is doing it on purpose. I really like this one because I think oftentimes, especially if we are spending a lot of time with someone who's engaging in a behavior that we don't like, it can be really easy to get resentful or to say, to assume worst intentions, like, oh, they're doing it on purpose, they're doing it, to spite me, XYZ, right? And really very, very often that is not the case. And there's something else going on that we need to examine. Another steering committee member, Micah, said these quote behaviors don't just come from nowhere. We have to think about the unmet need. People need to have choices in their day. And it's worth noting that the more restrictive of a setting somebody is in, the less choices they have throughout their day. And these can be, big life choices, but it can also be things like, what do I get to eat for breakfast? What clothes am I wearing today? Who do I get to talk to? Where do I get to go? The things that a lot of us who live, fully independent lives take for granted. When those choices are taken away, it can become really, really frustrating. So as an example of thinking about identifying these underlying needs, let's say that I need to release anger. I'm feeling really upset. And the way that I deal with that in the moment is to pick up this coffee mug and hurl it across the room. Now, my friend who's in the room with me needs to feel safe, right? It's like basic human 101. We need to feel safe where we are. And she doesn't feel safe when I'm throwing things and freaking out. So how can we meet both needs? How can I have a healthy way to release my anger and feel those feelings while making sure that my friend in the room with me doesn't feel unsafe? Now, what that can look like, what might change is very dependent on a lot of other context. But to figure that out, what we're starting with is figuring out that behavior comes from a need to release anger, and that however my friend reacts comes from a need to feel safe. A really helpful framing for looking at this concept comes from Richie Reseda, who is, I'm going to call him a social justice practitioner. He has an organization called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. So he works with formerly and currently incarcerated people to help them not become incarcerated again, and also does a lot of really great work around just the justice system in general. So here's what he says. Justice is like detangling hair. We start with our and each other's actions, then carefully follow them back to the human needs those actions are based in. Just like we start with the ends of our hair and follow them back to the roots. Then we rearrange our actions in a way that respects everyone's needs. We can't get frustrated and cut someone's actions from the context of their needs, just like we can't just cut our hair off when detangling. It's the commitment to contextualizing people's actions and their needs that allows us to transform harm rather than cancel, commit war, and incarcerate each other. And I think this is just such a great visual and a great metaphor, because when we're looking at a risky behavior that someone is engaging in, oftentimes our analysis kind of starts and ends with like, what is this behavior and how do I make it stop? And when we do that, that's cutting off the hair at the tangle rather than following it back to the root, right? And so we have to dig a little bit deeper and figure out the context and the need that this behavior is arising from, so that we can stop, you know, doing damage and cutting people's hair, as it were. In order to do that detangling work, we have to really work on understanding people. And this can be really hard, especially when you're trained in a very specific way of formal assessment. But the assessment that we do, both formal and informal, so just in terms of like observing a situation unfolding in front of you and thinking about what's going on, we can't just be thinking about checking boxes. We have to actually listen to people and come at it from the perspective of the context that they exist in, and not necessarily just our own context. And so, in other words, we kind of have to work on listening to understand rather than kind of mentally putting everything that someone is saying into these predetermined boxes that we have in our head. And what kind of helps us to expand those boxes, expand the possibilities in our mind of what can be going on with someone to get a more accurate understanding of what they're going through. Culture and values play a huge role in that. So it's important to understand that risk is relative. And in some cultures, as an example, casually or like jokingly insulting someone, teasing someone, in some cultures is a sign of affection, right? And in other cultures, it can be considered really rude and not okay to do. And so as we are, you know, working with people and trying to understand where they're coming from, that cultural context is really important to consider. Kind of on the other side of that coin, it's important to understand that not everyone from the same place or background is the same. So if you have somebody who identifies with one cultural group who behaves a certain way, that doesn't mean that everybody from that cultural group behaves that way. And additionally, just because someone was raised in a certain culture that may have informed how they live their life thus far, that doesn't mean they want to stick to those norms for the rest of their life as they develop their independence and continue to learn and grow as a person. So understanding that cultural context is really important. And part of how we develop that understanding is going into these conversations with curiosity rather than judgment. So when we're curious, we listen to understand. And when we're being judgmental, we're listening to fill those predetermined boxes, and we've kind of made up our minds about someone before we even really understand what's going on. And so it's really important to, when you feel yourself checking off those boxes in your mind, it's important to think, okay, yes, that is one option of what this could mean, but what are the other options of what this could mean? What are other ways, what else could this behavior or this situation actually be communicating to us? And it's important to remember that as we're trying different things, we're trying to get this information and come to this understanding with people, it probably rarely happens on the first try, right? Especially as you're just establishing and building rapport with someone and learning them, basically. It takes it can take a lot of time and a lot of trial and error to figure out the best way to do that, and to figure out the supports that are going to actually be most supportive for them. And we'll talk more about what that looks like in a bit. Another part of developing that understanding and building that relationship with people is creating safety. A person needs to feel safe in order to receive support in a meaningful way. Just because you logically understand that you're being asked to do something doesn't necessarily mean that you feel safe to do that thing, right? Which is often why it gets labeled as quote unquote non-compliance. And often what's happening is that it's not that the person doesn't want to do what you're asking them to do, it's that they can't because of how they're feeling and what their nervous system is doing. One of the biggest ways, one of the biggest things that disrupts that trusting relationship and that sense of safety is shame. So when we're saying to someone, hey, the thing you're doing is bad and you need to stop doing it, or you're going to be punished, what that can sound like to someone who's experiencing navigating risky behavior is, oh shoot, if I do this, I can't tell you about it, so that means I need to hide it. And that leads to a lack of clear understanding of what's actually going on with the person, the breadth and depth of whatever behaviors they're going through. If they feel like they have to hide it from you, you're never going to be able to support them in the most meaningful way. And it's important to remember that people who are struggling with a particular behavior or just struggling with mental health in general are really dealing with fear. And what that fear is of really varies from person to person and situation to situation. But the cure, or kind of the salve for fear, is not punishment, because punishment just creates more fear and more of a sense of shame. What helps people to overcome fear or to cope with fear better is connection and feeling like they're not alone, that there's someone that they can go to when they're struggling with these things. And to create that sense of connection, we have to help somebody feel safe. The metaphor that I like to use is that dough can't rise in a cold room. You know, if you're making bread, you gotta proof your dough in like a nice warm little place. Similarly, people cannot reduce harm in a hostile environment. So if somebody doesn't feel like they can be free of judgment and punishment and shame, which is different than accountability in a way that we'll discuss in a minute, that makes it really, really hard to do the work of healing, which is difficult work. Another thing that I wanted to raise around this idea of creating safety is the concept of aftercare. So often when we're talking about risky behaviors, we're thinking about either preventing them or dealing with them in the moment. And we often forget to think about what happens in the aftermath. So one of our steering committee members, Micah, said, we need people to check in with us after meltdowns instead of just leaving us on our own. And there are some people who will want like space, in immediately following a meltdown, right? But that's different than like pretending it never happened, and like leaving them to like fully sort through those feelings on their own with no support. And so, what aftercare looks like varies from person to person, and we'll discuss that in some of the resources that we have towards the end here. But just keeping that in mind, that the aftermath is a part of like that cycle and those like patterns of behavior. So yeah, just wanted to flag that. So we've talked about kind of figuring out the root, right? So in our detangling hair metaphor, a lot of what we've talked about so far is what's going on closer to the scalp, right? What we're figuring out, what needs are going unmet, and kind of the broader context behind the behavior. Now we're going to talk more about what's happening in that gnarly part of the hair that we start with untangling, right? And that's where we want to talk about harm reduction. Some of you may be familiar with harm reduction. It is probably most, I guess, broadly known in the context of treatment for substance use, or support for people who are using substances. And in that world, what it basically means is instead of going for this abstinence only thing where, you need to like stop drugs cold turkey right now, or we're not going to help you, we say, okay, so we know you're probably not going to stop doing drugs overnight. How can we make sure that you're doing it as safely as possible, and not causing unnecessary harm to yourself while you're using those substances? And if abstinence is a goal for you, like we're reducing that harm as we're working towards sobriety or whatever recovery looks like for the person. In our world here, while substance use, as many people brought up, it can be a type of risky behavior, it's not the only type. And so we can apply harm reduction to these other contexts as well. And so the idea is, instead of trying to get someone to stop doing a behavior completely, which we would call abstinence, like cutting it off cold turkey, we help them to do the behavior or meet the need behind the behavior in a safer way. And the reason that harm reduction is one of the reasons that harm reduction is so effective, is because it takes the shame and stigma out of the behavior. So instead of saying, hey, what you're doing is bad and wrong and you need to stop right now, we're saying, hey, I see that you're struggling with this and it's maybe causing some issues in your life that are not ideal for you. How can we make sure that if you're going to be doing this, you're doing it as safely as possible? And how do we mitigate the other unintended effects that it has on your life while we're working on supporting you? And yeah, I'll just talk about tapering in this next slide here. So an example of harm reduction in this context is cutting. So like self-harm cutting. So there's kind of the tangible tools of harm reduction, things like making sure that if somebody's going to be cutting themselves, they're using sterile blades. Because if you're using a rusty blade or a contaminated blade, you're more likely to get an infection, right? Making sure that they have wound care training and an easily accessible first aid kit, so that if they do cut themselves too deeply or in the wrong spot, there are resources available to stop before they bleed out or cause some other kind of major damage. Another part of harm reduction in this context would be tapering. So here that could mean setting small goals to reduce cutting. So let's say a person is cutting their whole forearm. Maybe this next week we try to keep the new cuts in a smaller area. Or if somebody is cutting every day, setting a goal to have one day in the next week where they don't cut. And just setting these small measurable goals that we can work on a little bit at a time. Now, usually when we present this idea to people, they kind of freak out because they're like, why are you endorsing people self-harming? That's not what we're doing. What people need to, or what we would like you to try to think about here is that just because you tell someone to stop cutting doesn't mean they're going to stop cutting immediately. And it doesn't mean they won't return to it, even if they do stop now. So what we're doing is making sure that if this behavior is going to happen, we're not causing, or that person is not causing additional or unintended harm to themselves. And while we work on getting them to stop cutting, redirecting them to a different behavior that meets whatever need is behind that, we are keeping them alive and keeping them from seriously harming themselves or seriously hurting themselves. So what's important to remember when we're talking about harm reduction is, again, my dough metaphor, these harm reduction strategies won't work if we're keeping the person who needs support in that hostile or stressful environment. So we kind of have to do these two things at once. We've got the harm reduction strategies at the tangly part of the hair, and we've got the identifying these root causes and doing that kind of almost like detective work towards the root of the hair, right? And we have to kind of work on these things at the same time until we meet in the middle of the hair and everything is all nice and pretty. It's, in other words, we can't work on the behavior or change the behavior or stop the behavior without learning how to meet the unmet need that is causing the behavior. Great example of that, one of our steering committee members, Emily, she said self-harm can feel like a way to take control. So that's pretty clear right there what the unmet need is that could be causing self-harm, right? Danielle said self-injury for stimming versus for self-punishment are different things. Taking it out on yourself instead of someone else because you'll get in less trouble. So this is a great example of like the context for behavior, right? Somebody who is hitting themselves because they enjoy the physical sensation versus somebody who's hitting themselves because they actually want to hit the person next to them because they're pissed off, but they know that if they do that, they'll get in huge trouble, so they hit themselves instead. It's the same behavior, but it's coming from a different context, and we can't appropriately address it without understanding what that context is. So we talked a lot about risk factors and the things that can cause risky behaviors. But we also want to talk about protective factors, which are things that can help to reduce risky behaviors or make it less likely that someone will engage in them. They're parts of a person's life that can help them to be safe and happy. Positive relationships with caregivers, family, friends, providers, all of those are huge protective factors. And so that's why everything we talked about around like building trust and understanding is so important, because it creates your relationship, or that whoever's relationship with the person, it creates a protective factor in the form of that relationship. One of our steering committee members, Micah, said we need to use strength-based interventions. Protective factors can help us keep people in a better state of mind. And I think, oftentimes when we're talking about, trying to get someone to stop or reduce a behavior, we're thinking about what's going wrong. It's also important to help people understand what are the things in your life that are going right? What's going well for you? How can we increase the amount of things that are going well for you? How can we sustain those things so that you continue to have the protective factors that you do have, and also build up more as you're going along. Other protective factors range from the very basics, like just having enough food to eat and a place to live, things like that. And also, as Stacy brought up in our last session, that communication access stuff that we talked about earlier is a huge protective factor. Having appropriate access, consistent access to robust forms of communication are hugely beneficial in helping people cope with life, and also just like survive and thrive. And I will turn it back over to Noor to wrap us up here.
Thank you. So yeah, adding back in with protective factors, autonomy, also a protective factor. So autonomy talks about the idea that someone gets to make choices about their lives. So for a lot of people with IDD and mental health disabilities, it's very common for us to have had choices taken away from us for a long time. And recognizing that along with that, this is a type of trauma. So trauma-informed care for people with this experience means empowering them with choices. So again, wrapping back to this idea of protective factors and around the idea that navigating risky behaviors involves a certain amount of control and trying to find control where you haven't gotten it elsewhere. Autonomy can be a key factor in helping kind of correct that balance. Because if people have less control over their lives in some respects, if you don't have a lot of control, you'll look for places where you can get it. And that can show up as what are considered risky behaviors. So if you don't get choices around, for example, when you wake up, what you have for breakfast, who your friends are, who you get to talk to, what control you lack in your life in other places, you can often try and make up for it in others. So making sure people have access to autonomy is super key. Next slide. So some quotes from steering committee members that talk about this. Alicia notes that we need to find ways to stop repeatedly traumatizing people by making them relive their trauma every time they go to get services. Kim notes that PTSD can trigger meltdowns and vice versa, and that we need to pay attention to the relationship between these things. Sometimes we just need space, don't keep poking the bear. So again, noting that people will have different asks for aftercare following meltdowns. So not everyone is going to want immediate engagement. So clearing that up ahead of time. Monica notes the system is not transparent with people receiving treatment, and that doing that, so being transparent with people receiving treatment, means that we have to treat adults like adults and make them aware of consequences. Micah notes meltdowns are part of life. Non-disabled people have bad days too. My emotions can be big sometimes, so we need to co-create plans to deal with meltdowns rather than trying to get them to go away entirely. Which ties into our next slide. Tools for providing choices. So again, noting that the basics here are making sure people have access to the communication method or device of their choice, that people have accessible information and have the freedom to unmask and to stim without judgment. In addition to these things, some collaborative planning tools that will be linked in the presentation that goes up online are tools to manage triggers, which is a worksheet from Max Barrows and Perry, and that talks about basically helping folks think about what their triggers are and ways that they want to kind of navigate dealing with them as they come up. What to do when I don't feel okay, from Ren Nkololoni from Communication First, talks about a plain language explanation of how to plan for crisis situations and how to navigate them and options as they come up. Pod mapping from Mia Mingus with help from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. This is a resource they came up with together. Talks about, it basically has a worksheet that helps people plan what they want to happen if they are in a crisis, who they would want contacted, what resources they'd want access to and when, that kind of thing. We also have resources about supporting decision making over at ASAN, and a bunch of these are also linked on the Link Center's resource page. Next slide, please. We're going to go ahead and turn it back over to the Link Center for us to start our group exercise.
Great. Thanks so much, Noor and Jules. For somebody who identifies myself as a clinical professional, I know that what you talked about really gives me a lot of things to think about and to think about things differently. And so now is the time that we're turning it all over to you, as I mentioned in the beginning. What we're going to do is we're going to present a scenario that talks about navigating risky behaviors. And we're really hoping to hear from you and how you think about this topic through the discussion, through the scenario. Perhaps your reactions to what Jules and Noor just said. But we want to say that there are no wrong answers or ideas, because we believe that you're the expert of your own experience and the place that you all come from. And this is putting the shared back in the shared learning group, because we really just want to hear from you. And the Link Center really takes it on as a responsibility that hearing from you about what you're thinking, so that we can elevate things you bring up on our website or in future forums like this. And also, there are things that we know that we haven't thought about when we think about this topic. And so we would like to take action on some of those things as well. So how you can do this, you can raise your hand to come off mute. You can even come on camera. If you want, you can write your thoughts in the chat, and we'll also put our email again in the chat so that you have that, and you'll be able to follow up with us if you want to add anything additional after our time together today. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carly Winnie from NAD, who will get us started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carly Winnie. I am the Chief Operating Officer at NAD, and our group discussion prompt is: you have an adult client who has regularly ended up with welts on her arms from repeatedly slapping them. You feel worried. What are some questions you can ask to better understand the situation? And again, you can type it in the chat or come off mute. Kristen Smith said, do your arms itch? That's, yeah, I mean, sometimes asking, you know, the more obvious question is the right answer. Is there something else you can slap? From Casey Smith. Emily Branscombe said, when is this most likely to happen and most likely not to happen?
I appreciate out of the gate that folks are already thinking about ways that they can include the person in sort of this, as Jules talked about, restorative lens. Like we're trying to unpack the why, right?
Adriana Hodges said, I might say, I'm noticing some welts on your arms. Are you okay sharing those with me? How you got those? That's great.
So I think these are all a good start. I'm going to read Dawn's real quick before I make my comment, but Dawn says, how do you feel before and after, which I think is really important. And I'm going to challenge you all too to think about, you know, from what Jules and Nor talked about, those risk factors, right? So think about that in really trying to unpack the why. I appreciate the comment around maybe a more general question. Is something bothering you? And is there something I can help with? Another reason why I'm appreciating these questions that are being directed at the person is because oftentimes I think as clinical professionals, we're trained to ask others, right? In a lot of the assessment and the work that we do, it's asking others for their perspective. And I remember as a young behavioral specialist myself, just that huge aha moment I had when I finally just said, I'm going to ask him why he's doing that. And in, you know, that 5 minutes, I had gotten all the answers I needed to better support him. So again, really appreciative, especially with this group, to hear you all starting with from a place of asking the person.
I also just want to say, I appreciate the questions that Kristen is asking, because I think what we're getting at there is that maybe these welts are not coming from they're not a quote unquote behavior, right? So if we're asking, are your arms itchy? Maybe we're thinking, oh, could these welts come from some kind of allergic reaction? Do you feel safe where you live and work? Or maybe do these welts, are they coming from someone else hurting you, right? So we want to, what I love about that is we're avoiding the problem of diagnostic overshadowing, where we're assuming that every problem is coming from something related to one attribute of the person. And we're thinking more holistically that, you know, it could be coming from a variety of different factors, because that's how life works.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jules. And I think all of it, right? All of these questions in sort of totality really is a holistic view and not just pigeonholing the why, right? I don't want to lose the other comment made in here. Do you need a fidget item to have in hand during these times to occupy your hands? And I think that gets a little bit to the next prompt. So I'm just gonna take the liberty of, oops, we did it again. We did it again. So if we think about same situation, and let's say that she indicates that she's slapping her arms because she likes the feeling and it helps her stay focused on whatever she is doing at that moment. That gives us more information, right? So now we have more information here. And thinking about what Jules and Nor challenged us to think about, what are some options for harm reduction you might be able to do based on that information? Okay, I see. Emily says, could you use a rubber band instead? And then taking it a step farther, she may be able to use a hairband to snap on her wrist if that can replace this feeling.
Yeah, so lots of great suggestions in terms of kind of like one-to-one sensory replacement, which I think can be really helpful. I shared in the last the last group when we were talking to direct support professionals. I used to have a big problem with pinching my skin really hard until I would like bruise or like sometimes break the skin. And I finally found a fidget that successfully replicates that feeling for me without me hurting myself. And it took a lot of trial and error to find something that meets the same need. But that's what this takes sometimes, right? So like maybe you do suggest like, hey, would you be willing to use a rubber band? And then she tries the rubber band and she's like, oh, I hate the texture of this because the rubber rubs up against the hair on my arm and pulls at my hair and I hate it. So then maybe we would say, okay, what if we tried a hairband that has cloth covering on it so that the rubber isn't pulling at the hair on your arm, right? So just keeping the channel of communication open, and being willing to try some trial and error stuff, until you come to something that can work sustainably. I also wanted to bring up something that someone said in the last session that I thought was great, which is, well, if she's not like causing serious harm to herself or anyone else, can she just keep hitting her arm? And I think that's like a great reframing, because a lot of times when we're looking at someone doing something that we think is unusual, our first instinct is like, oh, make it stop doing that. But sometimes like we have to kind of like take a step back and be like, okay, this isn't hurting anyone. It's unusual maybe for me, but it's also like fine. So maybe this is not the hill we need to die on today.
Right. Jules, great, really great point. And again, back to, the teenager that I just asked him why he was doing what he was doing, and really realizing that it wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't hurting himself or others. It wasn't dangerous. And it was just annoying to the parents. And right. So his obsessive asking questions, right? And so was it really, as you're saying, which I love that, and I use it myself, was it really the hill to die on? And, as an outside observer, I saw so many other things that, really could be addressed in terms of supporting him in his home. So that's such a great reframe and good point. And other people are agreeing. Compression sleeves was also recommended as an alternative. And I think that goes back to Jules' point about trial and error. And I also, another conversation that we had earlier was really around, oftentimes our support starts before the what hits the fan. And in that sort of preventative or proactive mode is a place where we can, get to know the person, that maybe it doesn't need to do trial. You may know all those things, like Jules, you described about the rubber band, right? You might know that and go, rubber band's not a good idea. I know that they're not going to like that, because you understand who this person is. You had taken the time to get to know them. And the conversation that we had earlier really revolved around really understanding in a proactive way how somebody communicates. And so that you don't always, back to my earlier point, need to rely upon others to understand that this is working for somebody, this isn't working for somebody, this is when this happens or when this doesn't happen. And rather you can rely on the person themselves, because you have found that communication, whether to another really good earlier point that you made, Jules, both receptive and expressive.
Yeah, one last thing I just wanted to add related to communication is that something that I hear a lot, especially from people who are supporting folks who are non-speaking, is that like, well, we can't figure out the context behind the behavior because the behavior is the communication. Like that's all we're getting from them. And I think what I would challenge about that is it kind of reinforces what can be a reason why someone is engaging in that behavior is because it's the only time someone is paying attention to them, or like really paying attention to them and what they're doing. So while the behavior might be communication, it's not the only communication, and we need to look at it as a part of a bigger picture and not the only thing. That would be like if you only listen to someone when they were screaming at you, you know, like you also have to listen to them when they're talking to you at a normal volume, to like get the full picture of what they're saying to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jules, and thanks, Carly, for helping to facilitate that. Again, super helpful to hear how you all are thinking, how you're taking the content and reacting and applying that as well. And so now I get to turn it over to our colleague from NASHA who can introduce himself, Zeta Ricker. Hi, Zeta.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much again for being here and the great discussion. I am Zeta Ricker. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Policy for the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, one of the partners of the Link Center. And again, really want to thank all of those who are here today. We want to ask you again and wonder if anything that you heard today changes the way that you think about the words risky behaviors, and invite you to drop those thoughts in the chat as we continue our closing remarks. Please do continue to add to the chat what are your go-to resources, training, websites, and where you get information and supports that will help us develop the materials and really inform us about where you go for information to navigate risky behaviors. Next slide, please. Here is the schedule of past and upcoming shared learning groups. We've had a number of really great conversations, and you can find all of the recordings and transcripts from the past events on the Link Center website, and would really encourage you to tune into those if you weren't able to participate at the time. And then you can also find and register for our upcoming shared learning groups on the website as well. And the next topic in January will be about moving through the justice system. You can visit the Link Center's website at any time. The address and link are here on the screen right now, and we will drop it into the chat as well. Feel free as well to always email the Link Center if you have questions or suggestions. We do have a quick evaluation that we hope you will complete for us. On the screen is the QR code that you can scan with your phone, and I think Stephanie will put it in the chat as well. It will also pop up when we close out today and will be sent out to everyone in an email. I just want to share how seriously we take these evaluations and really look at feedback from folks to make adjustments for future activities. So encourage you to participate in that. So finally, thank you so much for participating. Again, a special thank you to our colleagues at ASAN for joining us, and also like to thank members of the Link Center's steering committee for their time and their input for these shared learning groups. And of course, thank you to the Administration for Community Living and to all the partners for contributing to the preparation and content for this meeting. And I think that's all for today. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.